And when we account for the Promethean myth, even humankind itself is considered as lowly as the snake in the eyes of the Greek gods. Here we have an image of Zeus in the form of an eagle, rendering his daily punishment upon Prometheus by feasting upon his liver for his crime of stealing fire from Mount Olympus and giving it to humanity. It's yet another example of the eagle as an enduring archetype representing superiority and justifying oppression over those who are deemed unworthy. And of course, there is the story of Zeus and Ganymede. And this is I'm going to read a little bit from Homer's Iliad. Ganymede was the loveliest born of the race of mortals, and therefore the gods caught him away to themselves to be Zeus's wine pourer for the sake of his beauty, so he might be among the immortals. So it's not difficult to see how such attitudes could be found amongst human beings as well. And when I say humans, I mean how some humans might see other humans as lowly or not as good, right? Oh, I'm thinking like maybe the likes of Prince Andrew comes to mind, if you know what I'm saying. So we can appreciate what is really happening here once we take a moment to think about what impact the Christian Bible's social conditioning campaign had on Western civilization. A campaign which falsely claimed that the unworthy snakes among us are not as good as the rest of the flock. Some important questions worth asking at this point are: what does the tree of knowledge actually represent in the book of Genesis? Why is the serpent associated with the tree of knowledge in the first place? Because if the serpent is so lowly and despicable, why is there an association with this lowly, despicable animal and the tree of knowledge of good and evil? Okay, you have to ask that question. And why would it be virtuous for Adam and Eve to abstain from this knowledge in the first place? To begin with, the tree of knowledge represents, of course, the knowledge of good and evil, or in other words, psychological differentiation between self and other, or is otherwise symbolic of the paradoxical nature of free will. The reason the serpent should be an integral part of this story is because, beginning with the story of Adam and Eve, snakes have been commonly associated with treachery and evil. We only need recall that Satan, taking the form of the snake and seducing Eve with his words, has made the snake the perpetual villain ever since. Any person who is not to be trusted, of course, we refer to as a snake in the grass, or an unsavory group may be referred to as a den of vipers. However, the idea of the devil taking the form of a snake and manipulating Eve, of course, was entirely a Christian invention in the first place. And we know this because it's widely believed that Moses wrote the book of Genesis. And Moses, being a Jew, would have no conception of Satan as a separate deity from God whatsoever. So such an idea could be traced back to the dualistic cosmology of the Persian Zoroastrian religion. But if there's no, if there's no buy-in in this from the audience, and you're not believing what I'm saying, then just ask any rabbi what they think of such a notion. Ask them if Satan should be a deity separate from God, much less a deity that took the form of a snake. The idea that there should be God and Satan representing the eternal struggle of good versus evil, that's decidedly a Zoroastrian idea, but not at all Jewish. And it was the Jews who authored the Bible. So there you go. Now, eating from the tree of knowledge attempts to equate blind obedience with virtue. So this is answering the other question. And this doubles as a get out of jail free card for God. Okay, so that the world in its imperfect form with all of its suffering is not God's fault, but it's the responsibility of a woman who is gullible enough to believe the lies of a completely fictional deity who was not even imagined to exist until perhaps 1,000 years later. So, if this story about Satan taking the form of a serpent is completely false, either due to misinterpretation or manipulation, what parts of this story coming from the Christian Bible are to be believed at all? This isn't to say, I'm not saying that Christianity is one big lie, because that certainly would be an oversimplification. However, there remains an unseen yet easily explained dynamic at play when it comes to false narratives such as the Christian interpretation of the book of Genesis. To begin to understand this, we must be reminded that Christianity was derived from Judaism, of course. And while this is no big secret, we have to understand exactly why Christianity and all other religions for that matter have no choice but to oftentimes contradict stories which came before and sometimes even vilify the deities of other religions. Now, why? It's because for Christians to keep the original Hebrew interpretation of the book of Genesis intact, this would mean that Christianity would have no identity beyond Judaism. So there would be no reason for Christianity to exist. Cultural and religious identities must always be asserted in terms of self and other. Otherwise, everything arises from that which came before has to be changed in some way, or else there's no distinction at all. Now, I'm getting into the eagle and the serpent with Christianity and Judaism as well. So maybe that will give you a little prelude to what's coming up. And so the age-old formula for burgeoning religions and cultures is, of course, to borrow heavily from their big brother culture next door, change a few key elements, and then promptly vilify or wage war against a culture from which their traditions were first appropriated. This is a pattern throughout human history. Even the traditions of Judaism have been shown to contain many ancient Persian influences, for example. It must be understood that influences are often changed, if not completely contradicted, and then are combined with the traditions of the host culture in order to be considered unique. There is nothing new under the sun, of course, and this pattern of cultural and religious syncretism is found everywhere. And we must also consider that every distinct region on Earth will most certainly have its own distinct characteristics of environments and subsequently the people who, for various reasons, will interpret and understand the world in a slightly different way in accordance with such varying factors of the environment. Of course, there exist many relatively harmonious and syncretic religions or cultures which may span many different regions, but at some point there exist certain differences between those cultures which seem irreconcilable for one reason or another. And of course, between the extremes of syncretic harmony and dangerous rivalry exist 10,000 varying shades in between.